Ja, mine damer og herrer, så er vi klar til at gå i gang og begynde. Jeg begynder nu med at sige velkommen dansk, og så skifter jeg til engelsk, og vi forbliver i engelsk under resten af arrangementet. Welcome and thank you very much to Sherin for the great pleasure and the great privilege that it is moderating this debate. I am very happy to be asked. Now let me start out by introducing the panel to you so you know which one is which, and then I'll offer a few brief practical remarks and maybe a remark that isn't quite so practical before we begin as a way of introduction. In the middle, of course, Sherin Khankan, as you know, chairwoman of Critical Muslims. She is the initiator of this debate today. She's the author also of Islamic Reconciliation on the Danish Islamic for Somi that came out a few years back, and a very prominent and important voice in Danish debate on these issues. We have to the right, sitting here, Nawaz, who you may know. At the age of 16, he joined Hizb-ut-Tahrir, which is of course the topic of today's discussion. He came out last year as a prominent critic of the organization. He is the leader of the Copenhagen Foundation, and the Copenhagen Foundation really is, together with Critical Muslims, Kritiske, the basis of this debate today. And the object, of course, is to mount a rather sophisticated and nuanced criticism of the organization. To the very right in the panel, Ed Husain, today better known as Ed Husain, Ed being short for Muhammad. He is a PhD. He's the author of the international bestseller, The Islam. That was mentioned that Mr. Nawaz is coming out with both DVD and the book and the notable merchandise, I believe, all dedicated to this project. So these are the participants. What we will do is we will hear each of them speak for about 15 or 20 minutes on the questions that you may know from the homepage. These of course are the principal questions concerning Hizb-ut-Tahrir, concerning the nature of Islam. Who is to say what Islam is? Who is to say what a Muslim is? Who is to say what is and what is not? Good Muslim ways of living. And of course also questions that relate in a broader and a general sense, and we have seen this happen in Denmark, a broader and general discussion about what attitudes and what organizations indeed can be tolerated in modern society. Now, first part of this debate will run for about an hour. We will then do a 5-minute break, and it will be no more than 5 minutes, but I believe we will all need it. Maybe to get a bit of fresh air, and also to reflect on what's been said, so that we, when we join up together in this remarkable break, we will start out by taking questions from the floor. And really that will be the main point today. Much more important than these introductions, not to deliver them in any way, is your questions, ladies and gentlemen. That's what this is about. And so please start thinking about them now. Now, I promised you one remark which is a little less practical, which is to say that it should be no great surprise to anyone that there are a lot of people here today. And anyone who follows the Danish political debates and the discussion in Denmark, even in the slightest degree, can be in very little doubt this remains the central focus and the central issue of the political discussion. Now, this may be because it is very important. It may be because that the Muslims in Denmark represent a great challenge and a great problem. It may be because the politicians and the media have other reasons for wanting to talk about Islam rather than talk about other issues. I think it's a combination of both. But it remains a great issue. I do believe that there is an illusion at the moment in some quarters that we have seen the end of this debate. I believe that if you think back to 2001, back to the late 90s when this debate emerged, that there were great belief in many quarters, both among those who were critical of Islam and among those who spoke in favor of Islam or in favor of multiculturalism. There was the feeling and the sense that this would be a brief debate. It would take a few years, and then we would have agreed somehow on the rules by which to live in a modern society. Now that hasn't happened, and I don't believe it is happening now. I don't believe that what is seemingly emerging as a new consensus in the political landscape will mean the end of this debate, rather the opposite. I do believe that we will live with this debate for many years to come, and it may be that the issues of contention, that the concrete issues that we debate and the questions that are significant and around which people rally day to day and week to week and year to year become ever thinner and become ever more specific, but they are of course all related to the grander issue. So this is indeed the main debate in Denmark. It is important for anyone who has an opinion on it and a stake in it to speak up and speak out. And hopefully that is what is happening at the moment. It's not only of course a political debate, but as we all well know, it is an issue that has considerable attention generated around it in the rest of Europe and even in America. That was just a brief introduction, and now it is my great pleasure to give the floor to Sherin Khankan, the chairwoman of Copenhagen. Sherin?
Good evening. Assalamu alaikum. Can you hear me? A Western journalist once asked Mahatma Gandhi, "Mr. Gandhi, what is your opinion of the Western civilization?" And Gandhi replied, "As you may know, that would be a good idea." Gandhi questions the definition of what it means to be a civilized society, a philosophical question about who has the right to define the absolute good values. I believe that civilized values as democracy, freedom of speech, and equality are not Western values, but universal values. The clash is not between civilizations, but within the same civilizations between different people with different opinions and different ideas. East is east and west is west, and never shall the two meet. We often hear the sentence quoted in the Danish media in different variations, not at least by Hizb-ut-Tahrir. The dichotomy between Islam and the West, Islam and democracy, Islam and secularism, are constructed dichotomies manipulated by people. I am a Muslim living in the West, my mother a Christian from Finland, my father a Muslim from Syria. Within me, I carry East and West, Christianity and Islam. I am a faithful believer, a practicing Muslim, and a secularist at the same time. The problem is that the terms secularism and secularization often are misinterpreted by some Muslims as well as some non-Muslims. Secularism is the ideology behind secularization. You cannot speak of secularization without secularism. But secularism can exist without secularization. A society can have a vision of secularism without being secular itself. Secularism is not identical with non-religious society. Secularism is a confrontation, not with religion, but with any kind of dogma or dogmatic thinking. My point is that secularism can coexist with Islam and with religion. So when some Danish politicians and media conclude that in order to integrate European Muslims successfully, we have to privatize religion and deny or even eliminate religious arguments from the public sphere or from the political debate, I believe they are misinterpreting the real meaning of secularization. I will argue the opposite. Europe should not follow the French model, but seek to give room for religion. Religion can play a part in the political debate as inspiration. Critical Muslims always advocated for a dialogue between religion and politics, as long as religious arguments do not become dogmatic or demands to be privileged to other non-religious arguments. The idea of Islam as an all-compassing way of life or ideology is shared by many Muslims all over the world. It is not something you can reduce to a small group of radical groups only. But Islam as a political ideology and movement was brought to life in concrete form with the establishment of the Muslim Brotherhood in 1928. The Brotherhood laid the ideological fundament for many of today's Islamist movements. The criticism of the West, according to some of these Islamist movements, has to do with politics as well as social values. The term Islamism is referring to Muslims who considers Islam as a political ideology. Many Islamists are working for a united Islamic world, the caliphate, economically, socially, politically, and militarily. Islamists believe that God is the ultimate legislator, and therefore they reject democracy, a term they define very narrowly as man is the legislator. They believe that only God has the right to legislate. At the same time, they see democracy, secularism, and capitalism as one thing. You cannot speak of Islamism as one thing or as one big movement. Islamists differ in opinion and actions, and there are many different interpretations and variations of Islamism. In my book, Islam and Reconciliation, a Public Matter, I differ between three different kinds of Islamists. Reform Islamists, a Muslim who wants an Islamic reform by reforming the individuals, and when consensus is present, they want to establish the Islamic State. Radical Islamists, Islam should be forced upon people by revolution, whether it's consensus by the people or not. And in the end, jihadists who uses violence as a method. This is also a categorical distinction. There are many other different kinds of Islamism than the four mentioned. Islamism, or an Islamist, is a term used by secular societies to describe the Muslims who have turned Islam into an ideology and who uses religion to seek political power. It is important, though, to notice that the term Islamism is not used by Hizb-ut-Tahrir or Islamists in general. Islamism is representing a new political and social way of reading and interpreting the Quran. The society has to be Islamic in its root. Islamism is, in this regard, a modern phenomenon. Hizb-ut-Tahrir is an example of Islamism in concrete form in Denmark. They have recruited members from all levels in society, also and in growing numbers from Danish universities. The university-centered Islamism is also not a new phenomenon, but has dominated since the 1970s. I once asked a brother from Hizb-ut-Tahrir how they were capable of gathering 1,000 people to their conferences. The brother replied, "People always have 1,000 excuses not to join a meeting or a conference, but we are willing to die for our cause, the establishment of the caliphate. Nothing can be more important. The longing for the caliphate is stronger than any worldly relationship or desire. We are willing to leave our families if necessary," he said. Islamism is seen as the new threat to the Western secular societies by some media, politicians, and academics. In Denmark, we have an ongoing discussion about whether to ban the party or not. Many politicians are seeking a way to ban the party in Denmark, but so far they have not succeeded. In 2003, Malene Grøndahl, Kristine Sinclair, and Torben Rasmussen published the first academic and balanced book on Hizb-ut-Tahrir by the title Hizb-ut-Tahrir in Denmark, Dangerous Fundamentalism or Innocent Youth Revoltment. They conclude that Hizb-ut-Tahrir is a challenge to the Western societies and not a threat, mostly because they, despite their aggressive rhetoric, seem to practice and promote a consequent non-violent ideology in Denmark. At the same time, Hizb-ut-Tahrir members seem to be resourceful, strong young people who are able to attract young people, young Danish Muslims, and who often dominates the Danish media debate. I agree with this view. Still, Critical Muslims has dedicated this year to challenge Hizb-ut-Tahrir in Denmark on an intellectual level, mostly because we consider it a duty, irregardless of the context, to say out loud that we do not share Hizb-ut-Tahrir's interpretation of what it means to be a Muslim. I believe that Hizb-ut-Tahrir lacked the ability to see the importance of understanding the inner dimensions of Islamic practice. There seems to be a lack of real wisdom in certain areas. Sharia and Haqiqa is the inner dimension in Islam, is not practiced in a unified and balanced way. Too much focus on the intellect instead of the heart. You have to understand who you are, your inner self. Arrogance and ignorance comes from not knowing yourself. Allah says, "The heavens and the earth do not contain me, but the heart of the believer does." Who is truly a Muslim or a believer is up to Allah to judge, not us. Our criticism, though, is different from the criticism made by most media, academics, and politicians. Hizb-ut-Tahrir and political Islam is a factor in the Danish democracy. Political Islam is not something we can make disappear. We disagree with Ed Husain when he claims that the real distinction should be made between Democrats and anti-democrats. A true democracy should be able to contain anti-democratic tendencies. The term anti-democrat is being practiced and defined very differently. If we ban Hizb-ut-Tahrir, the problem will not disappear, but grow. Most politicians know this, so the aim with banning is not a wish to make Hizb-ut-Tahrir disappear, but to criminalize them. We consider Hizb-ut-Tahrir to be our brothers and sisters, but sometimes the right adab or courtesy is to be hard in a given context and speak your opposite opinion, keeping in mind that we essentially bear the same intention to worship Allah correctly. We seek to understand before we criticize. We seek to be objective in the sense that we try not to be affected by the social constructed media-made prejudices about Hizb-ut-Tahrir. We wish to build up alternatives and to help young Danish Muslims leave the party. We do not wish to forbid Hizb-ut-Tahrir, but we wish to challenge the party with intellectual argumentation. This involves a critique of the ideology, a critique of the way they view history, past and present, a critique of the language, a critique of the method, a critique of the misuse of Islamic terms. It is possible to be a political Muslim, to fight injustice, to dream of a united Islamic world, the so-called caliphate, without manipulating a dichotomy between Islam and the West, between Islam and democracy, between Muslims and Christians, between Islam and secularization. Political Islam is not in itself a threat, I believe. You can combine religion with politics. What is important is how you combine the two. The real challenge is to find a way for all of us to live together despite of our different opinion of how a just society should be. We have a growing number of Islamic activists in Denmark. Most of them contribute to the Danish society in a fruitful way. But we have a growing number of Muslims, political Muslims, who turn Islam into an ideology and who lack the sweetness of our faith, Islamic faith, who lack the deeper understanding of the importance of embracing pluralism as an essential tool for peaceful coexistence. Hizb-ut-Tahrir is a challenge to the Western societies simply because they divide the world into Islam and the West, because they do not accept alternative interpretations of the Quran. They believe that their political interpretation of the Quran is the only acceptable and valid interpretation, and therefore they feel morally superior due to the fact that they are Muslims and use the word kafir, translated as unbelievers, to denote all non-Muslims. To sum up, we critical Muslims do not believe in condemning the party, but we believe that we should challenge the party members with solid arguments and invite them to a critical dialogue. The critique has to come from within the Muslim community. Therefore, we have established international connections with Muslims in Europe. For this purpose, critical Muslims have decided to cooperate with ex-members of Hizb-ut-Tahrir from London, Maajid Nawaz and Ed Husain, and William Foundation. We do not wish to make headlines in the media, but to work on a grassroots level to make real change within the Muslim community. My last remark, forgive me. Multiplicity and diversity are a blessing from God according to the Quran. The Quranic ideal of the good and just society or a human being is not conditioned by race, gender, belief, or nationality. The only thing that separates one human from another is spiritual excellence or virtue, understood as righteous actions. To do good towards one fellow human beings and accept one's neighbor despite our differences, these are some of the clearest signs that a person carries Islam within their heart. Kindness, patience, forgiveness, and tolerance. We believe God created a world of multiplicity because He wanted us to want multiplicity, so as to understand His unity. Thank you.
Thank you, Sherin, and we move wrote down the speakers list with Minister Maajid Nawaz when he was 16. He joined Hizb-ut-Tahrir last year in May of 2007. He led the party. The decision to join as a nation at the age of 16 is one for which he spent 5 years in the Egyptian prison. Nawaz, the floor is yours.
Hello and welcome to everyone here, and thank you for having us. Assalamu alaikum. What I'm going to say here today, I want to conclude by saying to anyone who may have sympathies to Hizb-ut-Tahrir, or may have been a member at any point in their lives, or a student of Hizb-ut-Tahrir, or anyone who feels that perhaps they've had a hard time in the media of late due to their protests against the cartoons affair, and that they are championing the cause of Islam. I want to say, first of all, that what I will say from here is not because I have some hatred for this party. I dedicated my whole life to serving the cause, not of Islam, but of this Islamist ideology, which I realized later was not Islam. I was prepared to die for this cause. As Sherin mentioned, that this is what they would say. I've said this on many occasions. It's not because I have any grudge against Hizb-ut-Tahrir. I was prepared to die for this cause, and I went to prison because of my membership. When I left Hizb-ut-Tahrir last year, I didn't just leave a political party. I left my family. My family members are still members of this party. My wife is still a member of Hizb-ut-Tahrir. Her parents are still members of Hizb-ut-Tahrir. And it was a very difficult decision for me to leave behind my friends, because at 16 when I joined, abandoned all of the non-Muslim friends I had who didn't convert to Islam. In 1 year, 9 of them did convert to Islam, but the rest who didn't, I abandoned them because I felt I had to move on to recruitment. And the only people that I made friends with were people I thought I could recruit. It wasn't an easy decision to make, and I'm suffering the consequences of that decision. So I stand here as a critic of Hizb-ut-Tahrir, not because of a grudge, but because I sincerely believe that they are a danger. They are a danger to social cohesion for Muslims and non-Muslims, for our countries, for my country, Britain, where I was born, for your country, Denmark, where I exported this danger. I was partly responsible for what you see here today. And I stand here because I sincerely believe that what I thought I was prepared to die for was Islam. I realized afterwards it was the Islamist ideology, a man-made ideology, a modern construct. Islamism is the last man-made ideology, like communism and like capitalism. And now I will say to those members and supporters of Hizb-ut-Tahrir that I will now continue to dedicate my life and to dedicate my struggle to making sure that this ideology is put to rest. I will do everything within my power, and I will go from country to country to make sure that this ideology is refuted, because I am sincerely regretful for the seeds of this ideology that I planted in Pakistan from London, and that I came to Copenhagen and planted, and what I did in Egypt, and for which I was arrested. And I have seen the fitna, the trouble and the tribulation that is caused by the spread of Islamism. And I've seen with my own eyes, and the people that I spent time in prison with, of how Islamism grew into the beast that it has become now, beginning as a political resistance in the form of the Muslim Brotherhood, and transmuting into some form of militant, violent terrorism. All jihadists came from Islamist parties. The assassins of Sadat who were with me in prison, their teacher was a man by the name of Salim al-Rahal, who was a member of Hizb-ut-Tahrir. Salah al-Sirriya, in the 1971 military academy case, when they tried to fight with the military academy and overtake the arms and the ammunition dump, used to be a member of Hizb-ut-Tahrir. Sayyid Qutb, the one who wrote the Das Kapital for the Islamists, it's called Milestones, used to be with the Muslim Brotherhood and was then influenced by the ideas of Sheikh Taqiyuddin Nabhani, the founder of Hizb-ut-Tahrir, and then he wrote what he wrote in Milestones. Ayman al-Zawahiri, Osama bin Laden, all of them came from Islamist groups, the Muslim Brotherhood. So I've seen the dangers of this party, and I've seen what it can lead to. And I don't deny or dispute that one of the reasons why these groups move Muslim government and then to violently expand through conquest this state, and then they want one ruler for the whole world. Obviously that's very bad for humanity. Now it's time for the nuance. Islamism is more than just Hizb-ut-Tahrir. Islamists, as Sherin correctly identified, and I was actually quite surprised because the three categories were exactly the same three categories that I wrote down. I used slightly different words, but exactly the same idea that I was trying to identify. I've called them, number one, political Islamists, which are of the Brotherhood types. And the key point to remember with political Islamists is they believe that Islam is an ideology, that God is sovereign, and that all state law has to be synchronized with their interpretation of the Sharia. But political Islamists are what I call entry level. They try and infiltrate the regime from within the democratic process, to then change it from within, using democracy as a disguise. We have to be aware of this trend. The second category is what I call revolutionary Islamists, of the type like Hizb-ut-Tahrir, who are anti-establishment, who are trying to overthrow the status quo via military coups up and down the Muslim world. Keep in mind, these are military coups by and large against dictators and kings. And that adds another complication to the equation, because they are not military coups against democracies. If they were, then I'd say they shouldn't be tolerated. And the final category is what I call jihadists, and there's no need to elaborate on that because Sherin used the same word. And there's another distinction we need to make now after separating Islamists into three types, and that is that not all Muslims who are engaged in politics are Islamists. There are some Muslims who do not believe that Islam is an ideology, who do not believe that the Sharia has to be synchronized with state law. And what I mean by that is that legal and illegal on a state level needs to be the same as halal and haram for religious Muslims. There are some Muslims who do not believe that's the case because they believe Islam didn't mandate that. And they are engaged in political activity because, like their fellow citizens, they care for people around them. And these I call either Muslim Democrats or politically active Muslims. But nevertheless, they are not Islamists as long as they do not try and enforce the Sharia in whichever interpretation on a state level, which I think is a modern innovation. And the third type of Muslim, which shouldn't be confused with Islamists, is the conservative Muslim. By and large, he is apolitical, or she is apolitical. However, they may manifest certain trends of a medieval mindset. And what I mean by that is, for example, when they insist that a certain type of Eastern dress is a religious dress. They may insist that a certain type of cultural practice is from the religion, when in fact it may be from their country of origin and may have nothing to do with Islam, such as arranged marriages and all of these other cultural practices that we know exist, such as honor killings and others. Now, the conservative Muslim, and the majority of conservative Muslims, as a caveat there, do not support or endorse honor killings. But the conservative Muslim may be apolitical, but is many times confused with the Islamists. And it's important to remember that Islamism, being a manifestation of modernity, that same modernity that they use to define the political concepts, modern concepts such as sovereignty, statehood, legislation, which actually are present, they do not exist in the Quran or Sunnah, that very same modernity informs the Islamist in his social views. So you'll find that some Islamists, particularly the political Islamists and Hizb-ut-Tahrir, are actually socially quite progressive. Hizb-ut-Tahrir do not prohibit music, nor does Sheikh Yusuf al-Qardawi, who comes from the Brotherhood trend. Political Islamists may also not prohibit gender relations and the shaking of the hands, the greeting of men and women. So not to get confused, that you may see a Muslim in front of you. I used to dress like this when I was with Hizb-ut-Tahrir, and I believed that democracy was heresy and akin to apostasy. And I didn't have a beard, and I spoke the same English I'm speaking now, and I wore the same clothes that I wear now. So we must not confuse. An Islamist may appear very modern, and that's because Islamism is a manifestation of modernity. And that poor guy you see on the street who's wearing Pakistani clothes and a beard may be a sweet, innocent, apolitical Muslim who just wants to pray in the mosque. So we have to know the difference between these two categories. And in fact, that type of Muslim, by and large, comes from a certain trend called Sufism. In the Indian subcontinent, they come from the Brahmi school, and they despise politics in the mosque. I've been chased out of mosques when I was with Hizb-ut-Tahrir. I've been beaten outside of mosques and told that politics has got nothing to do with Islam. Because the majority of these Muslims who come from the Indian subcontinent, from the Brahmi tradition, believe that politics and Islam shouldn't be conflated as if they are one and the same thing. Though they don't have a problem with Muslims engaging in politics, not in the name of religion. Not saying that my particular political policy is the only one that God allows. So I personally have been chased out of the mosque when I was with Hizb-ut-Tahrir by that poor uncle that gets so much flack in the media. And so sometimes he's your hero. Sometimes he's the front line of defense against people like I was. And he's the conservative Muslim. He may have other problems. he may have problems in the social field, because the very same traditionalism that informs his apolitical stance is the very same traditionalism that informs his social stance. So just like because of his tradition, he doesn't like mixing modern political concepts with Islam, that very same tradition means he may support some form of dress code, which is Eastern, some form of arranged marriage, or other such cultural practices. And there's a certain way to speak to that person, but he shouldn't be confused with the Islamist. The Islamist is modeling both his political thought and his social practices. He's purely a product of modernity. But then what he's done is he's taken modern political paradigms, superimposed them on a medieval political model, and has come out with something completely different. And it's that I wish to talk about when critiquing Islamism. It's the way in which they have made certain modern political paradigms as fundamental tenets of the faith. And this is what we call in Arabic bid'ah, or in English we call it an innovation. I was just accosted on the street by somebody as I was on the way here in a district called Nuba. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly. Northern Bridge or something, apparently. I'll stick to English. That's what I'm going to say. I was just accosted on the street, and I was asked a question by somebody who, I must stress, was not a member of Hizb-ut-Tahrir. He was somebody who was supporting them. I know he wasn't a member. And usually members are a bit more disciplined than this man. And this man said to me, "You believe democracy is allowed in Islam?" And I said, "Yes, I do." And the reason why he was so angry is because Hizb-ut-Tahrir and other Islamists, not all of them, but they've made democracy as a fundamental tenet of faith. And they say it's kufr, or apostasy, heresy. And they believe it's a fundamental pillar of the creed to say that democracy is heresy, or akin to apostasy if you believe in it. Just like they've made the principle that sovereignty is for God as a fundamental pillar of the creed. Just like they say that anyone who says that man is a legislator, or that sovereignty is for the people, is an apostate. And which is why they consider me an apostate, because I say that people are sovereign and that man legislates. And in fact, it's a misnomer to say that God legislates, because the process of legislation is when human beings sit together and decide what laws are going to govern. Even if they decide we're going to select this particular Sharia law or that particular Sharia law and make it state law, it's still a human process. It's still man legislating. So when they say that sovereignty belongs to God, what they're actually saying, de facto, is that sovereignty belongs to that particular dictator who's going to decide what God's law is, though they won't admit it. But the very terms sovereignty, statehood, legislation, in Arabic, sovereignty is siyada. State is dawla. Legislation is tashriya. These terms, you may be surprised to know, you may not be surprised to know, siyada, sovereignty, does not exist in the Quran. It's not present. Nor in the Sunnah, nor in the tradition of the Prophet. Never mentioned. Nor is the word legislation, tashriya. Nor is the word state, dawla. Not mentioned once in the Quran. How on earth can we make these terms fundamental tenets of our creed when they're not even mentioned in the Quran? They're not ever referred to. Nowhere when the Prophet defined Islam did he say one fundamental pillar of Islam is that sovereignty belongs to God. Absolutely nowhere. And I request any Muslim who believes this to be the case to bring me this and show it to me. It's impossible to do so, and it's anachronistic because the word sovereignty is a modern political concept. It only existed in the Arabic language from about 50 years ago. That Islam is an ideology. The Arabic word for ideology is, guess what? Ideology. Ideologia. It doesn't exist in the Quran or Sunnah. In fact, Islam is a deen, a religion, the very same word that's used to describe Christianity in the Quran. It's a religion. So my critique of Hizb-ut-Tahrir in a lot more detail is something I'm working on, but it's essentially that they have taken modern-day political paradigms, imposed them upon the religion, and then claim that they are fundamental tenets of the faith. And then they're not willing to realize that these modern-day political paradigms can be reconciled with Islam in a different way. It's a process of reconciliation. I firmly believe that liberalism and Islam are compatible. I firmly believe that democracy and Islam are compatible. Not that democracy is Islamic. Not that liberalism is Islamic, because they're not. Because they didn't exist in the lexicon of the Prophet. That would also be anachronistic. What I'm saying is Islam is a religion. It can coexist in what is a modern democracy. Democracy was created by human beings. Islam is a religion. It can coexist within modern liberalism, because liberalism was created by human beings, and a religion is not at conflict with any one particular form of governance. So when I say compatible, that's what I mean. Not that liberalism is somehow founded by the Prophet Muhammad 1400 years ago, as the Ba'athist socialists claimed about socialism, and as the Islamists claim about their Islamist ideology, which is also man-made. And so I wish to end this by saying that just as members of Hizb-ut-Tahrir, and I did myself, feel the confidence to go and accost people in the street and challenge them and say, how dare you say this or that, and how can you say that Islam is compatible with democracy? And I challenge you, bring me your dalil, brother, bring me your evidence. And I say the same to them now. Please come, sit down with me, talk to me, give me some time. Give me 1 hour, 2 hours of your time. I invested 16 years in your movement. Give me 2 hours of your time just to talk to me. And I hope that you'll see that what I'm saying isn't as bad as you perhaps have heard through your code members. And perhaps you'll believe finally that I'm not an apostate. I'd like to end there and with a word of caution. I do not wish for this, everything I've said here today, to be misinterpreted by people that may have another agenda. I'm very saddened that people like Bert Wilder, with the film that he's made, have adopted the paradigm of Al-Qaeda, have surrendered to Islamist jihadists by accepting the definition of Islam that they have given, and then have pushed out that very same definition. That's surrender, it's capitulation. Because Islam is not defined for us by Al-Qaeda. Islam existed 1400 years ago. Osama bin Laden did not exist 1400 years ago, and for the whole of human Islamic Muslim history, Muslims weren't running around blowing themselves up in civilian quarters. So those who try and depict Islam in that way, or may wish to use my words to push out that agenda, I ask you please reconsider. That's a surrender to terrorism, and you have followed the same extreme as Osama bin Laden. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Nawaz. Now our third and final speaker, Mr. Ed Husain, will take the floor. He is a PhD, and I mentioned before, I will mention it again, the author of The Islamist. Sir, please go ahead.
With the greatest respect, I haven't completed my PhD yet.
Well, he's student then.
You're very ambitious, and I hope your dreams come to fruition. But thank you for the good wishes.
Leaving the PhD student community might be, a hazardous journey as well. So, have you ever considered it?
Could be, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, could be. I want to begin, if I may, with verses that often get forgotten in all of this discourse and discussion about Islam and Muslims, is that almost every day, sometimes more than 5 times a day, in their prayers, and at least on a weekly basis, Muslims start almost every recitation of what we consider to be the Book of God with these words, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In other words, we begin in the name of God, and wait for it, most compassionate, most merciful. The Al-Qaeda God is not a God that I recognize. When I was about 17, I remember meeting Maajid and going to Newnham College, where we did our A-levels together. And Maajid comes from a very wealthy background, and he had a huge house on the English coast. And we went to his house, and his mother said out loud to both of us that, and remember Maajid's mother's a Muslim, his father's a Muslim, my parents are Muslims. And I remember Maajid's mother saying, and I don't think you'll mind me saying this in public, that she said to both of us that your God is not my God. And we were shocked by that statement to the extent that we both came out and we said, she's no longer a Muslim, she's lost her faith, look at them. But we both said that. Now, almost 12, 13 years later, we've got to give it to her. She was right. We were wrong. And it takes courage, I think, for Maajid to stand here and say the things he said. And it's too modest a man to say to you what his own background is. And I can only say that it's a personal honor for me to share this platform with him and speak here after him. Because many a man has walked that Mazra'at Torah prison complex in Cairo, in Egypt, and given birth to the forces and the monstrosities that have led to 9/11. Men like Sayyid Qutb and the countless others, and some of whom Maj stood here and recalled, were the very men that gave birth to Al-Qaeda. Sayyid Qutb, influenced by Hizb-ut-Tahrir, who produced influenced his brother, Sayyid Qutb's brother Muhammad Qutb, who directly taught Osama bin Laden in the 1980s and the late 70s in Jeddah University. This I've documented by being in Jeddah myself for the best part of 7 months, only a year ago. to undergo that experience for 4 years, to undergo torture in prison, and to come out, and I've seen others who are with Maajid in prison have come out, and they're still spouting that same hatred, that same Leninist worldview, whereas Maajid has taken the other route and said, no, we can do better. So it's an honor to share this platform, and I think we should all sort of, be grateful that he's given up, his time and his own legal career to go around and commit himself to this work. That said, in the most respectful way, I'd say that we're not clones. One of the things that Hizb-ut-Tahrir does to people, it makes us all clones. You all think the same way, you all talk the same way, you all adopt the same ideas, you read the same books, you confront people in more or less the same way. Occasionally, I think it's healthy that we may, on small points of nuance, disagree, and that's a healthy thing. That proves human pluralism. So, you might see that come out in the Q&A session if you ask the right questions. So that's your challenge. While on the subject of challenges, I want to say that for the last 4 decades, 5 decades that this group has been around, it's the only Muslim group, well no, I shouldn't call it a Muslim group, I should call it an Islamist group, which has had the audacity to not only attack the vast majority of the world's Muslim scholars, from Azhar in Egypt, to Zaytuna in Morocco, to the hundreds of madaris in India and in Indonesia, to attack all of those scholars who've spent decades studying, taking their tradition in what we call an isnad system. Basically, if I were to be a Muslim, well, I'm not, but I'd study it with an alim, a qualified practitioner, who'd take it from another alim, who'd take it from another alim, who'd take it from another alim. This is called a sanad, and it goes back to the master of knowledge in the Muslim tradition, the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. That tradition has been maintained through men and sometimes women, and passed on to modern Muslims. Those people who have preserved that tradition have been under sustained attack from Hizb-ut-Tahrir, for being government sellouts, for being people who don't understand the Muslim world, for being second-class Muslims, for being people who sold out Islam. And people like Nabhani, the founder of Hizb-ut-Tahrir, have made takfir. In other words, have said they were kafir. People like Ibn Rushd and others who were the founding fathers, and I don't exaggerate when I say Western civilization. There was people like Ibn Rushd, Averroes, and Ibn Sina, Avicenna. Those of you who know your philosophical history will see those were the people who not only preserved but passed on Greek thought via Spain, which then led to the Renaissance, followed by what we see today in the West. So Western Muslims can't ignore that heritage. It's a historical fact. Those people have been made kafir by this man, Nabhani, and his associates. And since the founding of this party and the attacking of all these mainstream Muslims and scholars, they've been going around saying, we challenge anyone for an open debate, an open discussion. I mean, the media is here today. We at the Quillian Foundation have openly challenged Ata Abu-Ishta, the engineer who heads this movement, an interesting point, an engineer, and his cohorts here in the West to openly debate and discuss with Maaj and others. So far, not only have they failed to respond to that debate and that open challenge, but they've gone around muzzling their people, saying to their people, whatever you do, don't go and speak to Maaj and others. We're all products of our experiences, and I want to share this anecdote with you today. The uncle that Maaj referred to is the kind of uncle we were praying with today for our Friday prayers. And those who confuse, Islam and Muslim, we haven't given up our faith. We see our faith as part and parcel of the solution. Islam is the faith that rescued us. We were here in Copenhagen today praying with a marvelous man, Imam Peterson. You may know him. And it's the first time I've heard Arabic and Danish combined. It's a real baffling experience to hear this man of God. And the same congregation, you had Muslim leaders such as Fateh Halawi, who's here with us today from the Muslims in Dialogue group. They were all there. We prayed. We came out. Imam Peterson's sister was with him. Maaj, I were walking along fairly, decently. I don't think we were provoking anybody. Up comes a guy on his bicycle, toothless, skinhead, thug-like, bomber jacket, says to Maaj. The first thing he says to them, not greetings, doesn't give his name, comes up to him and says, do you believe in democracy? I haven't had that kind of questioning in such blunt, rude, ever. And it's fine, we thought we'd walk on. But we thought we were noble people here, that these are people of the community, these are Muslims who are recognized. Imam Peterson is recognized on a European level as a European Muslim voice, much like Sherin. So we thought, he'd back off. He doesn't. He becomes physical, and he insists that he has answers. He starts to swear in English in front of an imam, and goes further and says, "You're the guy who's calling for Euro-Islam. How dare you?" And I'm not making this stuff up. There are witnesses who saw this. The point I'm trying to make is that this is going on here in Copenhagen, in a European city. You've got people in your midst who don't believe the system that you've got in place, i.e. democracy, consensual government, representative law, secularism, respecting the other, sense of tolerance and plurality, are the status quo. And that's a genuine problem. How do you deal with that? And some of those points we're going to tackle on, but bearing in mind that this is my experience today walking with Matt, I don't think they knew we were together. Matt got all the flag, I didn't. But I should also say that we went to Imam Peterson's bookshop, a great bookshop, by the way. If you've got time and you're in that neighbourhood for whatever reason, and you don't get accosted by these anti-democrats, hop into that bookshop, and a really good collection of books. But at that bookshop, we were sitting there, and in fact, I kindly offered to go and buy us lunch, and he said, "Will you sit here and I'll go and get something to eat." Within 5 minutes, 6 minutes, they were a group of 30, 40 young boys standing on the other side of a bollard, sending the same biker over and saying to us, "Why don't you come and talk to us? Why don't you come and talk to us?" We were warned off and we drove away, but it's deeply, deeply painful to see that mob mentality, that sense of fascism, that sense of we will fight you down, that sense of we will silence you, that sense of we will intimidate you, is alive and well here in Copenhagen in this day and age. So we're shaped by our experiences, and today that was an experience, and if I come across harsh, I blame it on those guys. So I can't take the task on that. What is Hizb-ut-Tahrir? For me, Hizb-ut-Tahrir is not a movement, it's not an organisation, it's a collecting of ideas. These people are bound together by a certain world view, a certain training, a certain kind of being, a certain human being. That's what binds these people. They're the only group within Islamist circles that go around saying we're a movement. We're an intellectual movement. Last Monday at the World Economic Forum meeting, T.J. Winter, a Nobel scholar from Cambridge, Hakim Murad, he mentioned this, and I quote him. So I'm not being a neocon, a warmongering dude when I say that this is a war of ideas. And this is the key. This is not about banning organizations, and this is not about arresting people, and it's not about torture. It's a war of ideas, and you've got to win those ideas. But if you don't, you're just as bad as the fascists who want to overthrow democracies and impose their own dark, totalitarian world on the rest of us. And we've been there here in Europe in the 1930s. Are they a threat or a challenge? I think they're both. I'm responding here to questions that were given tasked by Sherin, so I'm going through those. I really think they're both. That they are a threat and they are a challenge. In some countries they're a genuine threat, and there's been several military coup d'etats attempted by these people in North Africa and in the Middle East, and in those countries they were a threat and they've dealt with it in their way. But in our context, here, 400 years after the Reformation, and 2 world wars later, where Europe stood up against this kind of ideology of totalitarianism and expansionism, it's a challenge. Should we ban HC is the question that's been bandied around a lot here today and also in your media. And I happen to be the guy who wrote a book for my sins last year, and in that book, in the concluding chapter, I advocated the ban of HD. I said that they should be banned. But something happened after that. I did an interview with your, forgive my pronunciation, Highlands person? Highlands person, that famous newspaper for the wrong reasons. And the guy asked me, why was it that you changed? And I've got to say the change came about as a result of meeting Maajid. That here was someone who spent time in prison, gave 14 years of his life to this group, married into this group, his in-laws are from this group, his wife is from this group, his son goes to a school that's run by that group, and he was saying we can't ban them. We had deep discussions, and I've got to give it to Max that he's right. If you ban these, and I was wrong, I have to say that. But if you ban this group, you lose the argument. You say that democracies cannot deal with pluralism. That's the message you give out. At the same time, we have to be cautious, those of us who espouse representative government and consensual government, that we shouldn't allow or of these kind of groups to build up numbers, because we turn a blind eye to them until they become serious enough, and by that time liberalism becomes self-destructive, because we've said we're not going to ban these groups and therefore give them a blank check. So it's striking that balance in order to win the argument that you identify the challenge or the threat, in this case the challenge, when it emerges, and deal with it. And in Britain, that's where we are, and that's why we're bold enough to say we've issued a public challenge. Where's the response? Bring it on. Hizb-ut-Tahrir, you're the guys who go around the Muslim world saying, debate with us. Well, come on, here's the debate, bring it on. So far they haven't. So that's my response to that. Tony Blair, he called for the ban. Gordon Brown has been against the ban at that current Prime Minister, and also David Cameron, the leader of the Conservative Party, has called for Hizb-ut-Tahrir to be banned. So this debate will hit us again in Britain. So we're doing Hizb-ut-Tahrir a big favour, because if either of us argued for Hizb-ut-Tahrir to be banned, believe you me, it would be banned. For our sins, both of us have been mentioned in Parliament in both sides of the debate. So if we called for this to happen in Britain, it would happen. It would. But we've given Hizb-ut-Tahrir, a lease of life. So engage with people on ideas. Another question set out was who has the right to define what is good and the power to define what is good. I'm sorry. That's a perennial question that philosophers have been trying to answer since the time of Socrates downwards. I won't attempt, but I can only say that we all have responsibility to define what is good and what is bad, and go with what Sherin said, our hearts. And Sherin's absolutely right in identifying the excessive intellectualism of those groups, taken perhaps from that Gramsci or Trotskyite tradition that emanated elsewhere, and more emphasis on the external rather than the internal. And the Prophet Muhammad taught us, istafti qalbak, that seek the fatwa or ask answers, or seek answers from your heart. So, human beings have you don't have to be a religious person to know what's right and what's wrong. Sam Harris might be an atheist, but his book, The Letters of a Christian Nation, he makes this point. That you don't have to be a believer in the religious tradition. You can be an atheist, and you can still know what's right and what's wrong. So I don't claim for a moment that it's the domain of people of faith to illustrate these things. I'll probably get called a pastor for saying that, but that's the truth, and that's tough if you can't handle it. How can we live together in a world with people from different opinions? Again, that's a very difficult question to answer, but the bottom line must be those things we've identified, and the bottom line must be, especially here in Europe, where millions of people have given their lives in the last century defending those values, that pluralism, respect for minorities, whether they be sexual minorities or whether they be ethnic or religious minorities, those values are not up for negotiation. They're not up for grabs. When we talk about European Islam, Muslims in Europe have to be up for that level of discussion on the level of values. Where do we sign up? Right now that discussion hasn't started. The Mongols, the Ottomans that were knocking on the gates of Vienna not so long ago, they all preserve a pluralistic tradition. Muslims often get accused of not being pluralistic and being intolerant. If that was the case today in India, there'd be no Hindus, because Muslim Mongols would have wiped them up over the 400 years or so they ruled them. Same applies to the Ottomans in Turkey and Greece and beyond. There was an inherent pluralism in those empires, and even before that. So that's really got to be the underlying agreement which we all sign up to. And the whole European Union project is based on that, and is based on identifying differences and respecting those differences, because you won't create a homogeneous society. The moment you try to do that, you go down the road that one man from Vienna went down in 1933, and look what happened after that. Should a democracy embrace anti-democrats? Again, it has to. It has to. If it doesn't, democracies have failed and they're not worth what they claim to be. It must. But at the same time, I go back to that caveat. We cannot sit on our armchairs on Friday evening watching television and hope all will be well. Just leave it to the politicians. It's not in their interest to sort this out. They play games with these issues. Leave it to the Muslims. Muslims alone can't do this. Leave it to the media. The media will play its own game, because there are journalists who want to make a name out of this stuff. We've all got to get involved in this together, because it affects all of us and all our lives. When terrorists attack London or Madrid or New York, or indeed Karbala, or Baghdad, or Istanbul, or Gaza, they don't identify certain individuals. they attack everyone. So we've got to stand together. It's not a cliche to say, Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya, one of the renowned scholars from Mauritania, who's now based in Saudi Arabia, a real giant of our times. When he said when he was in London last year that when the house is on fire and you've got to put the fire out, you don't ask who's bringing the buckets. You've got to do it. And the European house, and it's not an exaggeration to say this, coming now from, we've just come from, forgive me, from Vienna and from Athens, the European house is on fire, you've got to put the fire out. Finally, without going, I'm going to quickly say something before I finish, and that is, Hizb-ut-Tahrir in this country will split. It will split. It's split in almost every single country that it's operating. It will produce a group of people who will claim to be moderates and who will try to pull the wool over your eyes and not refer you to the literature and the things they believe in. But those guys you can deal with. They will produce a group of people who will do what has been done in Britain, combined with the drug culture, the criminality, that horrible mindset of killing people, unemployment, disrespect for the authorities. Put that in touch with Islamism and you have the creation of suicide bombers. What I saw today in that Northbridge area, sorry, forgive me, but those are the beginnings of a serious and worrying trend. We can deal with this in other ways, but it requires your political class or civil society to wake up. And thank you very much for listening.
It's very rare in any context, at any conference, to hear such thoughtful and meticulous contributions being made one after the other. Now, none of us need a break now, but as all of us will need a break in half an hour, we will take one now. And it'll be, and I mean this, 5 minutes. Thank you.
I think I should say that I live in the area that you can't learn or pronounce Nørrebro in Copenhagen. I found your analysis very interesting and deep going, and it struck me that it is almost word for word the same criticism or analysis that Tariq Ali has put forth towards the Islamists in general. So you must have heard this criticism when you yourself did not believe in it. So I would like to know, how did you react 3 years ago when you heard, so to speak, your own words? That's the first part of it. The second part is that living in this place in Nørrebro, I see Hizb-ut-Tahrir every time they make a demonstration. And I must confess that I find them more or less cute, in no way dangerous. And I listen to their what they say, and I find them living not in the real world. And they look very much, and they behave very much, and they talk very much like the revolutionary generation of my own youth. They sound the same way, and they have the same non-realistic way of tackling what is really going on. So I think they cannot be a danger. Am I just naive or what? I think they are just like the revolutionaries 30 years ago. Absolute fun and no danger.
All fun and games. Ed, if you start, and then Maajid.
I'll just take the last part first and say I wish it were true that their bark is louder than their bite, or whatever, however that goes. Unfortunately, it's not. Your response is, your heart's in the right place. Your response was the response of the British authorities throughout the 1990s. So it's just a bit of empty noise. It's just hot air. It's just claptrap. 7/7 changed all that. So what they do, what you see as hot air, what you see as nonsense, what you normal people think has no significance, there are people in those ghettos in parts of Bradford, Birmingham, Keighley, who see what they say to be divine truth. What you see is just nonsense. They see as the word of God, as explained to them by HD. And the worst thing is, and Maajid will probably come into greater detail on this, is that they create an underworld, an underbelly, in which people on the outside, whose minds can't penetrate what's going on, where it makes it possible for adherents to that movement to see the world in them and us way, that they're kuffar and we're Muslimin. We are higher, they are lower. Their lives have no significance. What happens in Kashmir, Palestine, these people are responsible for. And ultimately what happens is, in that world, the best thing to say is these guys, Hizb-ut-Tahrir directly, will never pull the trigger. They will provide the mood music, and they have done that in country after country, the mood music to which suicide bombers dance. They're the guys who will come into the airwaves and say, we will never hand over our fellow brothers. It's haram to cooperate with the police. Democracy is apostasy. They're the guys who will say, we should never criticize suicide bombers because we don't know whether they're in the Jannah. They know they think they're the guys who produce all those arguments. So the intellectual framework is set by Hizb-ut-Tahrir, but not pull the trigger.
Maajid, and then Sherin, please.
Yes, thank you. The first question, sadly I never came across these arguments, and I wish I had done. Perhaps I would have left earlier. In fact, these arguments that I'm speaking of today, and in fact I was pleasantly surprised that Sherin's talk was so similar in her analysis to what I would have said, and I cut back a lot of what I was going to say because there was no need to repeat it. And I applaud her for both organising this event and facilitating our presence here today, and for her courage in speaking out against Islamism and trying to find a better way for the future. My arguments were informed, though not exactly the same as, a radical shift that has occurred in Egypt, which is not well known and needs to be publicised. And that is that the largest jihadist group in Egypt, the Assassins of Sadat, this group, the heirs to the Assassins of Sadat, their name is Al-Jama'a Al-Islamiyya. Al-Jama'a Al-Islamiyya, I was imprisoned with their founder, Sheikh Salah Hashim. This group, the new leaders, they had a leadership committee headed by Karam Zuhdi, who were also in the same prison complex. This group has, from the leadership down, recanted and abandoned Islamism and jihadism. They are still conservative Muslims, but they consider that it's illegitimate to overthrow the Egyptian regime through violence, and they consider that it's their religious duty to hand over any people who try and commit terrorist acts in Egypt, because they label them as Khawarij, which was a sect in Islam that rebelled against the companions of the Prophet with violence. This group are the very same group that were responsible behind the terrible bombings in Sharm el-Sheikh and all of the Egyptian bombings that were going on through the 90s. And they were half of a faction that split off from the group that assassinated Sadat in 1981. That group was called Tanzim al-Jihad. It produced two other groups, Islamic Jihad, Egyptian Islamic Jihad, and Al-Jama'a Al-Islamiyya. Al-Jama'a Al-Islamiyya were the largest group. At the point that I entered prison, they had 25,000 followers just in the prisons alone, let alone outside of the prisons. This group from top down has authored about 10 books, which is the leadership committee has adopted, reiterating in a slightly different form the arguments that I put out here today. And I had 4 years of my life exposed to discussing with many of their members, including their founder, as I said, and many other Muslims from the liberal background, from the left, and also from Hizb-ut-Tahrir and Ikhwan. So that's very quickly there where I inform my arguments from. The danger of Hizb-ut-Tahrir, very sad though it is, I have to say that I do disagree slightly and somewhat that they're not a danger. However, I do also say they shouldn't be banned because they're not a violent danger. But I think that the mood music is the best way to describe it, that they create an atmosphere and they provide a justification which can then be developed. The best example for that, we've got examples of that. The best example is what happened in the UK. When Ed and I were in Newham College, we radicalised that college. We took over the Students' Union. We were elected and we took over the whole Students' Union as Hizb-ut-Tahrir. We radicalised that college to such an extent that a person who was there on our invitation and appointed himself as our bodyguard ended up murdering a non-Muslim student in that college. We weren't criminally responsible, which is why we were never charged or arrested or convicted for that offence. He was. But we were expelled from the college because we were known as the intellectual leaders behind that. Later on in the UK, Omar Bakri Muhammad, who was the head of HT when that happened in Newham College, he was expelled from HT after having left them voluntarily for a short while. Then the leadership said, well, you're not welcome back. He then set up Al-Muhajirun, which is a known violent organisation. It's been banned now, so they go under different names. That's an example practically in the UK, how people that put out a certain song will always find people that are ready to dance to the tune.
All right, so just to dwell on that issue for one moment, now you mentioned that to radicalise the college. What was the ethnic and religious makeup of the college?
Here I get controversial. I think they call it multiculturalism. My problem with that is this multiculturalism creates, sadly, monoculturalism. And that's why I'm not saying end it, what I'm calling for is mend it. I was going to say we're in Britain, but we're in Europe, aren't we? So in Europe we can do better. We can have genuine multiculturalism, and not what we went to a college which was predominantly from one ethnic background, Pakistani, but there was also a strong African contingent from parts of Africa, from parts of Nigeria and Ghana. There are a minority of white students there. But on this point, no, I'll come to it later. But yeah, so that was ethnic composition. But the issue was that even though Muslims were by and large a minority, but a vocal minority, the reason why I got onto the multiculturalism point was that mainstream white liberal teachers did not have the audacity to confront our ideas and start that war of ideas.
But this radical argument, the radicalization, did that appeal to non-Muslims? Is that what happened there, or was it just that the Muslims stepped in and were the active students, and that was the way the college was radicalized? I'm wondering, this of course all goes to the heart of the matter, which is, what is the attractiveness really of Hizb-ut-Tahrir? What is the attractiveness of the doctrine? How far can it appeal? Well, how did it appeal to the students then? Sure.
I think for the first time in the early 90s, when we mid-90s, when we joined this college, for the first time, Muslims found a voice which was in English, which was not shy from discussing politics, a voice that was not shy from answering back. When I grew up, born and raised in Essex, a place in England, there's a bit of a reputation, which we won't go into. When I grew up in Essex, the mosque was full of imams that didn't speak English, that were from the most ill-educated backgrounds. In the Indian subcontinent, the tradition is that the person who fails in his education gets sent off to become a mosque imam. Then some of them get imported into the UK to become mosque imams in the UK. They've had the worst education in the Indian subcontinent, let alone in Britain. And they come here, they used to come to Britain in the mosques, didn't speak English, and then would have sticks and would hit the children if they were to ask critical questions. And that's happened to me in the mosque. I was repelled. I didn't want to go back to the mosque. I didn't understand or relate to this man who'd come from a village in a country that I've never been to. And that was the situation for the majority of Muslims in the early to mid-90s. Along came these young, educated guys. The person who recruited both of us to HT, by the way, is also from my hometown. He was a medical student. He's now currently the head of HT in the UK. We caused him a bit of a headache, but I do wish that he would sit down and talk to us, because we both know him very well, and he used to be a very good friend of mine. This person was a medical student. We were impressed by his ability to speak to us, to relate to us, to teach us how to stand up for ourselves. And that's the point, that there wasn't anyone, there was a political vacuum. And that's perhaps one of the failings of the first generation, though they have many, many good things about them, that there was a political vacuum left, and it was filled by Islamists. We, as people who are second and third generation European Muslims, need to stand up and fill that political vacuum. We need to stand up for civil society. We need to stand up for our values and our principles and engage with society in a non-dogmatic way.
Sherin?
Can I just come into something?
Sure.
Maaj just touched on something that shouldn't be just conveniently ignored as part of the picture here. European Muslims. We're here in Denmark, in Copenhagen, and one has got to be fair. It's all well and good asking Muslims to fight the extremism fight, but it's a wider responsibility as well. The fact that the vast majority of people here in Denmark have a problem with what's called guest workers, and this mindset that they're here for a short period of time, one day they'll go away and everything will be normal again. I'm sorry guys, we aren't going anywhere. We're staying, and we're not guest workers. We didn't immigrate. We were born on these islands. We're children of this soil. I've done this thing, Maaj has done this thing of running away, going to Egypt in Maaj's case, myself, Syria, Saudi Arabia, trying to find an alternative home. We stick out like sore thumbs. This is our country, well, this is our continent if you want us to be European, and Britain is our country, and people have got to get used to that and accept it. And on a very practical note, among media people, your opinion formers, you've got to be a little bit more responsible. When a journalist comes and asks an imam of a mosque in Europe, a journalist comes to interview an imam in a mosque in Portugal, in Lisbon, and asks, when are you going back to Islam? And the imam says, I beg your pardon? It says, your country, Islam, when are you going back to Islam? We've got problems. We've got to face it, and the Danes have a responsibility to wake up. It's white, predominantly blonde, blue-eyed Europe is over. Sorry, those days are gone.
There is an interesting point, though, and I'm sure it's easier for a Muslim to become a Briton than it is for Britain to become a European. What comes
Another case.
You ask Clement, what is it that attracts people to Hizb-ut-Tahrir? And I think if we look at the Danish context, the situation or the context in Denmark is that Muslims are always in a defense position. I used to be a candidate for the parliament, and what happens to most of the candidates, if they have a Muslim background, they, you have to answer the questions, where is your loyalty? Is it with the Sharia, or is it with the democracy or the Danish constitution? And of course not all young Danish Muslims are capable of answering these questions in the right manner, so they find themselves in a defense position. I believe that it's important as young Danish Muslims not to work on the premises, because the premises is wrong. When you ask that question, it is asked wrongly, because we don't need to make a hierarchy between Islam and the Danish constitution. They can coexist, both of them, without any problems. So the question is asked wrongly, and if you can't see that, you will find yourself sitting in a defense position or being in a defense position. That comes to the problem or the question, why are they attracted by Hizb-ut-Tahrir? It's because I think that some young people see Hizb-ut-Tahrir as the only organization which is beyond that defense position, because they do not care. So this is a part of their strength. They do not care. They have placed themselves, they have distanced themselves from being members of the Danish parliament, and that is of course something I really reject, and I find it very, very sad that they have done this. But still, this attracts people. They're the young revolutionary, and they're very passionate, many of them. I used to think like you some years ago, like 5-6 years ago, but I became wiser. I believe they really do. Hizb-ut-Tahrir is a challenge, and in Critical Muslims we have started counseling for women, and we have some women, and they are growing in numbers, who have severe difficulties. Not only women, it can also be men of families who have severe difficulties handling the fact that they have a brother, a son, or husband, a wife, who suddenly became attracted to Hizb-ut-Tahrir, and it is destroying families all over Denmark.
Next question.
I have two questions.
Please stand up.
Mira Skadegård-Thorsen, and I work with discrimination. So my main question is how much, in the Danish context, you might see discrimination is playing a part in pushing young people towards Hizb-ut-Tahrir. The other question goes back to, is it really that big of it? It makes, when I hear you speak, it really pulls the carpet right under my feet, because it seems, I thought it was a very small group. There are millions and millions of Muslim people. How big of a real threat is this? It seems bigger than it sounds bigger to me now than I had thought it was.
The Danish context or
The Danish context, one, and certainly you may have obviously one of the Danish context, and then a wider context. In percents, even if anyone has a percentage of this.
No, I mean Hizb-ut-Tahrir is a part of the active Muslim community, and the active Muslims in Denmark is a minority still, but it's a growing minority, and Hizb-ut-Tahrir is also a growing minority.
Within the minority.
Within the minority. But the majority of Danish Muslims, they are not active practicing Muslims, and most of them do not care to be called Muslims, and they're interested in other things. So, but of course they are dominating the media debate. They are dominating the picture on a larger scale. So they have a voice, and they have a strong voice, and when they have their meetings, their conferences, they are able to gather 1,000 sympathizers. In Denmark, yes. They just had a conference. And I don't know if we're 200 today, but they can easily gather 1,000 sympathizers.
So they have a voice, they have a strong voice.
Maajid, let me just ask you, when you came to this country basically as a missionary, this is what, like 7 or 8 years ago, and you came here to set up the organization in Denmark and to talk to Danes with their experience, how was their experience of living in Danish society different than the British one?
Just as a point of correction, I didn't set up Hizb-ut-Tahrir from scratch in Denmark, that was Pakistan. In Denmark I set up the Danish-Pakistani side of Hizb-ut-Tahrir. But their experience was similar to what I experienced in the early 90s. I think there's a slight time lag behind what happened in the UK and what's happening in mainland Europe at the moment. I was a victim of discrimination on many occasions whilst I was growing up as a teenager. I've had to witness many of my friends be stabbed more than once, twice, 3 times, more than once on multiple occasions. And they were my white English friends, and they were stabbed because they were deemed as traitors for having the audacity to associate with me. I was also obviously hounded and chased by these very same organised thugs. I was also falsely arrested on many occasions, on one occasion for suspicion of armed robbery, and released the very next day with an apology and without a charge, because my brother, not even me, but my brother had been playing as a 15-year-old with a plastic gun in around 1993, which is way before 9/11, and I believe it was okay for children to play with plastic pellet guns in those days. I don't know if it still is. But this form of discrimination, and I'm talking armed arrest with machine guns and guns pointed to our heads as 14-year-olds, they took it seriously. This form of discrimination, both racism and other, it did lead me to be very, very disenfranchised, feel very disenfranchised and bitter towards my society, the country where I was born. And that did contribute to me being willing to join Hizb-ut-Tahrir, because I was looking for an alternative to this. And so we can't ignore that. We can't ignore that if the same problems exist here, and to your point, when I came here, that's what I was told by these Muslims. They felt the same problems exist here, and they still tell me that the same problems exist here. I don't know if that poor boy that was put into a coma recently has anything to do with discrimination.
He died.
Oh, he died, my God. I don't know if that was anything to do with discrimination, but I was told that the same problems exist here, and people in the news, when they report a tension between a Danish Muslim and a Danish non-Muslim, both Danish, they report it as an immigrant at a fight with a Dane. If that's true, and I don't know if it is, if that's true, then that's disastrous, because what it leads to is we're basically pushing people into that direction, and then all they need after that is for an ideology to come along and to reframe the way in which they feel those problems, to recalibrate their minds and to define them as ideological problems rather than what they are, which is social problems. The size issue, very briefly, I know we have to answer briefly the size issue. As is all too often what happens, the voice of the organised minority controls the discourse of the disorganised majority, and that is the case throughout the world. So there's no point looking at the disorganised majority, because they never have a proportional say. We have to look at the organised minority. Within Muslim politics, the organised minority is dominated by Islamism. That's become the default. Hizb-ut-Tahrir is one faction of the Islamist paradigm. It's grown and dominated that paradigm to the effect that any other form of political expression is finding it very difficult to say that sovereignty belongs to the people, because that's considered apostasy. So in that context, if a man walked into this room, God forbid, and he was just one man, but he had a gun, then he's in the majority, despite the fact that we're all here sitting here and we outnumber him, because it's the power relation that's what's important.
All right, excellent. What we will do is we will do 3 questions from the floor, just one after the other, and then we will answer them. We'll start with the young lady at the back, please. Could you speak up a little bit, please?
Yes. When you said that Islam is not in conflict with democracy, I just think that maybe if you could please elaborate on that, because the way I see it is that it's not about free elections, because Muslims chose their leader by elections long before they did anywhere else. Muslim societies had basic human rights long before anywhere else. We had Europeans fleeing to the Ottoman Empire. They had a welfare system long before anywhere else. So I would just like to see because in my opinion, the problem is when the majority votes for a bill, for example, that demonized a certain group of people, like when you ban the veil, for example, making it impossible for Muslim girls to go to school, or when we have the Patriot Act, for example, in America, that makes it legitimate to pursue a certain group of people. That's where you're actually feeding the beast being Islamism in this case.
So it is a question of discrimination, that's what you're saying.
I would just like to have him elaborate on his opinion on Islam not conflicting with democracy.
All right, we will return to that. I'll just take 2 more questions from the floor and then we will go to the answers. This lady, please, stand up.
My name is Ed Husain, I'm a student at Copenhagen University. In my ears, it sounds like you are turning a personal vendetta into a moralizing discourse, and telling us what is right Islam and what is wrong Islam. And this is very symptomatic to the current situation. I mean, we've seen it in the history, Wahhabis against Sufis. So it's, I mean, please comment on this.
All right, please.
My name is Bashir Qurashi. I am chairman of European Network Against Racism, and I meet very often people with these issues, both in Belgium, in Denmark, different places. And I have a lot of respect for what you said, but I have also a problem with what you said. First of all, even I have a context with 27 I cannot see this situation which you are describing, what happened in UK, either in Denmark or in any other city or in other country in Europe. And then you forgot, when you say that Hizb-ut-Tahrir is a threat and European house is on fire, I think this is an exaggeration which needs clarification very much. Because if you look at the Danish situation, we have maximum 200 members and 1,000 sympathizers of Hizb-ut-Tahrir. And the same case is in every European country. And you forgot the Islamophobic and racism. I think the biggest threat in Europe today is not Hizb-ut-Tahrir, it is Islamophobia, anti-Semitism, and racism which we, the Muslim, experience everyday basis. And I think we should deal with that too. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just summarize quickly the 2 questions. I'll just summarize them briefly. The last one went to the point that the European House, if it is on fire, it's not Hizb-ut-Tahrir, which is a very small minority indeed. The first question was to the question of whether there is a problem between Islam and democracy, whether they can in fact coexist, and whether discrimination is an issue in this context. And the third question, and let's keep that, I think, for a separate round, is whether you gentlemen are turning a personal vendetta into and the effort to tell all Muslims which is right and wrong Islam. But let's start with the 2 other questions, Islam and democracy, and the question of the size and seriousness of Hizb-ut-Tahrir. Sir?
I think Islam is compatible with democracy actually for everything you just said in your comment. So I don't know how much more I can elaborate other than to say that democracy in the sense of sovereignty belonging to the people is absolutely not contradictory to Islam, because the Sharia is a religious code, and there's never been historically any precedent set by any scholar, religious scholar, that the Sharia law or the religious code for Muslims has to be synchronized with state law, which is the argument used by Islamists to say that democracy is not compatible because the Sharia has to be the state law, and that if man was to legislate, he may legislate contrary to the Sharia, and therefore sovereignty belongs to the Sharia or to God and not to man. And what I'm saying is that actually the idea, the notion that the Sharia has to be synchronized with state law is a modern innovation. No Muslim scholar has claimed that in the past because they didn't have the concept of state, they didn't have the concept of legislation. What they did say is that Muslims should adhere to their religious code, the Sharia, and the ruler should be just. That's how classically it was discussed. So I think that for that reason, because it's an innovation, when making law, we don't have to synchronize the Sharia with state law, rather we have to make law based upon what is good and bad for the country. So let's take one practical example. If a woman, some Muslims say a woman must cover her head, right? That particular concept of hijab, there's no injunction in the Quran or the Sunnah that it has to be enforced by a ruler, and that the woman who does not cover her head needs to be punished. It's non-existent. So for the Islamists to stand up and say that I need to make it illegal for you to walk in the street with your hair showing, I ask him, where does God say it has to be illegal? i.e., where does God say that the state and the ruler has to punish the woman for showing her hair? Because that's the meaning of illegal, that there has to be some form of sanction, some form of state punishment for a woman not covering her hair. That's non-existent in Islam. There is no state sanction for that. There is no state punishment. The discussion is only relevant in the hudud matters. That's the only place where Islamists have got a semblance of a discussion to be had. But in the example I've just given of covering the hair, there's absolutely no had punishment, i.e. penal law, that's been revealed for God by this. So the Islamist notion that the Sharia law has to be synchronized with state law and that everything that they believe is haram has to be made illegal is an innovation that God didn't claim. I.e. God did not say that you have to punish on a state level Muslims when they commit sins. So that's why I think democracy and Islam are compatible.
But what about the verse about punishing women for covering their hair?
There is no verse.
I mean, you have countries that ban the veil. So
Yeah, but that doesn't mean there's a verse in the Quran.
No,
That's exactly my point.
No, she said reverse.
But that
Oh, the reverse.
majority voted for that.
Did you say the reverse or the verse?
The reverse.
Right, the reverse. Countries that what, sorry?
Countries banning prohibiting the females from wearing the veil.
Oh yes, sorry. No, of course. That's what I'm saying. That the other extreme is also something which we have to oppose. Yeah. So French secularism, or the Turkish model, which is that women cannot cover their hair in government institutions. I think this contradicts freedom of religion. It's up to each and individual woman if they wish to do this or not. And for us to enforce that on a state level, we're abandoning our own liberal principles. So I think we have to speak out against that as well. I do apologize. I thought you said verse, not reverse.
All right, Ed, let me just I'll put the racism question to you, and I'll sharpen it a little bit, because the argument is this: if we can see that Hizb-ut-Tahrir is feeding on discrimination, and if we can see that people have legitimate worries and concerns that put them in a position where they might be attracted to Hizb-ut-Tahrir, then you could say, and I think this is what Rashid is saying essentially, then deal with the problem at its root, deal with discrimination. If there's this, then the problem that is of greater significance, that's what we should deal with, and that you, sir, by launching a criticism of Hizb-ut-Tahrir, is really making Hizb-ut-Tahrir a strawman essentially, and deflecting fire for what is the real concern.
The points you make about discrimination, I go back to the English example again. The point you make about discrimination, jobs, social alienation, and so on, and therefore we've got a huge extremism problem. Yeah, I understand that at one level. I understand that, but I say to you that the most deprived community in England are not blacks, are not Muslims, are the native, white, working class. Now, my question is this: why are they, and this is proven by report after report, especially if you look at, I think, the last May or June edition of The Economist, not this year, the previous year, why are they not turning to an ideology that says, not just a them and us mentality, but ultimately a worldview that says, you go commit suicide and you'll be rewarded in heaven? What is it that stops them? It's not essentialist to say that there is a certain ideology with a certain religious interpretation built into that. I concede the point about grievances, I do, but let's not think that the blame is always on the European other for racism, because I say to you, in Muslim countries where there is no racism, why are those groups there? In countries such as Indonesia, and take for example Malaysia, where these Islamist groups don't have those grievances, why do they exist there? And I can carry on going and making a defense case, but I will accept the point that yes, there are grievances, but I will add and say where there are no grievances, this is an ideology that creates grievances. That will, and you really want an example of that here in Copenhagen? Those cartoons came out 6 months before Hamas were burning flags, Danish flags in downtown Gaza. So, months before the embassy, with which I was really closely working, the Danish embassy in Damascus was attacked. Who made that a grievance? Muslims here in Europe. So you guys who are Muslims here saw those cartoons and just some infantile cartoon. What the hell? We've seen this kind of stuff before. But someone made it their business to highlight those cartoons out there among the nutters of the Muslim world. So there's your evidence that where there is no grievance, a grievance will be created, and a them and us mentality created. And if you want to go on about grievances and be in denial about that problem, that's your prerogative, you can continue to do so. But don't come blaming Muslims when something goes wrong and say, you didn't warn us. Why didn't you tell us who these people are? We're telling you, we're warning you. You don't want to heed the advice. It's a free society, your call.
Sherin?
I think we neglected something when we speak about Hizb-ut-Tahrir. We neglected the political situation, the war in Iraq, Palestinian matter, the inequality, injustice in the world, because these are, I think, some of the primary arguments that helps them recruit young people. So it's important also to look at the political situation, and even though that
I know that Hizb-ut-Tahrir would still propagate what they're propagating if the world was, if there was equality in the world, if there was no war in Iraq and so forth, they would still do the same, because the work for the caliphate or the struggle to establish the caliphate, they believe that it's a duty that God demands of us. So, but still the political situation is really something that helps them recruit young members. So if we really are concerned, we should also look at the political situation and look at the fact that we in Denmark are a part of the war in Iraq.
Sherin, thank you. Now, Maajid, to you, the vendetta argument, which was essentially this, if I understood it correctly, that your experience and its experience have turned you critical of the organization. That's all very well and good, but you now come out basically launching and arguing in favor of what some people will find is a new monotonous, a new singular definition of Islam.
I tried, but obviously I failed to explain away this point in my talk, that I didn't have a personal vendetta against HT. Someone who has a vendetta against something is usually unfair and unjust. And if I have been, I apologize, but I've tried my best to oppose a banning of Hizb-ut-Tahrir in the UK, despite the fact that I really am opposed and fiercely critical of their ideas. And even now, when I was recording the story of the person that accosted me in the street, I made a point of saying he's not with Hizb-ut-Tahrir, but rather he was somebody who supported their ideas. I try and be fair. If I fail in that, I'm a human being, and I always can stand to be corrected. There's nothing more I can say about the personal vendetta point, because you either believe me or you don't. It's something that's, I can say to you I don't have a personal vendetta, and you can say that I do, and we can carry on bashing heads on that point. But the right and wrong Islam is very important. I don't believe that anyone should define a right and wrong Islam in that way and not accept difference of opinion within it. That's my actual point that I'm making, that Islam is pluralistic, what we call in Arabic ijtihad, that the ijtihadat are many. What I'm saying is that the right form of Islam is to accept that there's not one view on things. I'm not standing here today and saying that the headscarf or the veil, the face veil, or this or that is the only way to look at things. I'm saying that people have to accept that religious authorities interpret religious texts in many different ways. So what I'm actually saying is, don't tell me that your view is the only right view. That's what I'm saying. Yeah, so I'm not trying to put out a right version. And I'm also separating Islam from political systems and political organization. So when I say democracy or liberalism, I made a point of saying that liberalism, I'm not claiming that the Prophet invented it and therefore it's the right version of Islam. I'm not claiming that the Prophet invented modern democracy and therefore modern democracy is the right version of Islam. I'm not. I'm saying because Islam didn't define a political system, we have to do what everyone else does. Muslims have to do what everyone else does. Use our brains and work out what best political ideology is good for us.
All right, thank you. There was a question there, sir? Please.
My name is Nawaz from Copenhagen City. One of the main issues that we are working in Copenhagen City is anti-radicalization and so-called social and cultural integration. And therefore I have a practical question. What should I bring with myself to my office when I'm tomorrow working with those young people in order to stop to get them involved with those radical organizations? Which kind of suggestion do you have? Is it more money for sport activities, more consultation, or what do you suggest?
Thank you. Complete question. Just take it, please.
Yes. Hello, I'm Saskia Dimpan from the Netherlands. We have a bond, they burn our flags together.
Hey.
I had a small little comment on the discrimination. I think it's very interesting to see that if there are different Muslims who all have to do with discrimination and are facing fear and mistrust of Islam, why does the one choose to become active in the parliament and the other choose to believe that there are no answers within the system, that we have to go outside the system? So I'd be interested in any personal comment. Something else, so we've been talking about Islam in Europe, European Islam, Islam in a liberal democratic context. I'm wondering if you have any suggestions how that form of thinking pluralist form of thinking could be strengthened, and are there institutions that could help? Should we have a European university for the study of Islam that can compete with Al-Azhar, that can compete with other forms of study? And any ideas you have on that are very welcome.
All right, excellent. Let me sharpen that a little bit before we go to the panel, because I'm wondering, Sherin mentioned in her opening contribution that Islam can indeed inspire politics, and Islam has a role to play in the public sphere. And I'm wondering about that, both Maajid and Ed in this one. Do you see that? Do you see a political role for Islam, a formal political role? What kind of role should Islam play in public debate?
When we say political Islam, Islamism, what we're referring to is several things, and this cuts across all groups, regardless of the Hizb-ut-Tahrir, Jamaat Islam, Hizb, it goes cuts across everyone. The first point is the point Maajid made, the desire to see sovereignty for God. The second point is that it emanates from the mindset set up, as Sherin rightly pointed out, Hassan al-Banna, and developed by Sayyid Qutb. The third point is that they're anti-West, inherently anti-West. The fourth point is, as a result of the third point, they want to see the end of Israel. And the fifth point perhaps might be that their derogatory attitude towards fellow Muslims. Sixth point might be non-Muslim. One could go on. But the basic point is this: that's not politics and Islam. Where politics and Islam intertwine is in the lives of Muslims. So I'm a Muslim, but I believe, as a Muslim, as someone who has a social conscience, personally defined by how I understand the interaction between creation and God, that there should be the redistribution of wealth, that there should be trade unions represented in the workplace, that there should be a welfare state. Those are by and large centre-left values which I espouse, and therefore I'm on the centre-left. But I have plenty of Muslim friends who believe in a patriotic state, who believe in minimalist government, and therefore they're by and large on the centre-right. Now, there is no such thing as a predefined Islamic politics. Those people, whether on the centre-right based on those values, and they take that from Islam, those on the centre-left with those values, and they also take that from their religion, are Muslim Democrats, just like you have Christian Democrats. It's not sophisticated.
So you're saying, so just to make it very, very obvious here, you're saying that if there was such a thing as a Muslim party that ran for Parliament, the British Parliament, the Dutch Parliament, the Danish Parliament, and said, we're going to work for Sharia, we're going to sit in Parliament and we're going to work for this agenda, we're going to further this agenda in the name of Islam, they're not good Muslims.
They're not good Muslims.
Is that what you're saying?
I'd say they're stupid Muslims. I'll tell you why.
Which is roughly the same as not being very good Muslims.
I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. Because when they say they want to work towards Sharia, and this monolithic attitude, so this thing called Sharia, like Sherin said, this contradiction between Sharia and the Danish constitution, it's a total myth. It's a big lie. It's a big lie. And I defy anyone in this audience, academics, whoever, to prove to me that the Sharia has ever been and will become a monolithic entity. It never was. Just looking at one school, the Sunni school, there are at least 4 schools of law. The very basic point I'm trying to make, and you remind me of television presenters with your push for time, is that the Sharia has always been open to multiple interpretations. The Prophet of God, we believe, Muhammad said that the difference of opinion is a mercy to my community. I can go on with scripture, but the point I'm trying to make is this: that Imam Shatibi in the 13th century, those of you who want scriptural references, talked about the Sharia and its aims being what's known as maqasid. In other words, aims of social security, of justice, of knowing family lineage, of freedom of religious practice. Those aims of the Sharia, of that legal body, any system of law that can facilitate that can facilitate security for its citizens and so on, is what we call a way, and in other words, literally a Sharia. So the point being this: when the Archbishop of Canterbury created a huge hoo-ha last month and the month before about Sharia law in Britain, many Muslims, and I include people like Tariq Ramadan in this, came and said that the British legal system is already Sharia compliant. Take that. So what are you working towards? It's the emperor without any clothes.
And did that make people feel better or worse?
It depends on the kind of person you are.
All right, back to the ball, please.
Hello, my name is Noreen. I'm with Critical Muslims, and I also work for Amnesty International. So it's an honor to meet you, and you too, of course, actually. I have a question, and maybe I'm the most slow person in all this audience, but I'm just wondering what happens when you recruit a person for Hizb-ut-Tahrir. What's the process? Because I can understand that very young people, 16, 17, when you're very passionate and you're very angry and there's a lot of emotion when you're very young. But when you mature and when you come in your mid-20s, and what's the process of including someone to become a member of the Hizb-ut-Tahrir? What do you say to the person? Because in my opinion, the most important thing in religion is love, and it's compassion. And it's not excluding anyone from that love and compassion. But is that what Hizb-ut-Tahrir does, that we only love our own? Is that the way they recruit?
You know, last time I came to Denmark was in October, and we had a training session. We had a 7-hour session on that very question. So I'm not going to attempt to. Basically, I went through. Hizb-ut-Tahrir have weekly cells. They call them halaqa in Arabic. 2 hours, closed meeting, which is secret, where if you're more than 15 minutes late, the door's closing, you're not allowed in. And it's usually a cell of 5 with 1 instructor. And they intensely study Hizb-ut-Tahrir's ideology for 2 hours in an intensive grilling session every week. Usually a member both teaches that to another session, a group of 5, and receives it from within his group of 5 by another teacher. And in most cases, a member gives more than 1 circle to people. So you can do about 8 hours a week spent on discussing ideology. That's how they maintain the indoctrination. What exactly the content of what they discuss, I spent 7 hours. Sherin was there, Fatih was there. It was the Muslims in Dialogue that, thanks to them, that they organised this, and it's on CD. It's recorded on the website of Quilliam Foundation. You can download it, and basically, it's I went through their books chapter by chapter to describe how somebody can take someone from being an angry teenager who's got grievances and take them into becoming an ideologue. So I do encourage you, if you have the time, to watch that. But otherwise, there's also going to be a book written about that. But there's 2 questions we haven't answered: the practical suggestions and the different people to react to grievances in a different way. I don't know if you want us to. Yeah, well, practical suggestions. I do apologise that the chair forgot to answer this question. But practical suggestions is I think that on the youth level, and the person that asked the question, I don't see him now, but yeah, there you are. On the youth level, I'm not an expert on youth work. My field is to provide a counter-narrative to the ideology so that people like you who are experts in your field, when you discover that someone starts becoming radicalized due to the problems that you deal with every day, you have something you can give back to him. You have a critique of the arguments that he'll put to you. So my field is to develop that counter-narrative. That counter-narrative, I'm involved in training people from top to down, in terms of even, I'm talking about civil society, I'm talking about civil servants, I'm talking about human rights organizations and people like yourself. We're involved in training people so they're equipped with that one element of the problem, because you're dealing with a whole host of other things, such as drugs and other things as well. Yeah? I don't have all those answers. I'm focused on one field, which is how to de-radicalize and how to provide that counter-narrative and the counter-ideology. What I would say is that in that field, it's very important that Muslims, because integration is a 2-way process, just like Muslims have a lot to do and probably have more to do to make themselves at home as Europeans, non-Muslims have a lot to do as well. We just came from Athens, where there's not one official mosque recognized by the state. I do know that here there's one that has planning permission, but it hasn't been built yet, and that needs support. If that is allowed to continue, the message it sends out to Danish Muslims who are born and raised here is that you don't belong here. You've got nowhere to pray. That's a big problem. How do you expect someone to say, no, I'm Danish, I'm a Muslim, and there's no them and us, when on the other side you've been told, well, you're a them, you're not an us, and you've got no right to pray? That's a big problem. We have to realize, as Ed said correctly, I'm 3rd generation, my son is 4th generation. We're not going anywhere, guys. You know, we're here to stay. We didn't immigrate from anywhere. I've sat with people in debates on TV as well as in political circles, and I've said to them, don't define for me what it means to be British, because I'm just as British as you. So if we're going to define what it means to be European or British, my voice has an equal stake in this discussion as does yours. Just because of the colour of my skin, that doesn't make any difference. So we're here to stay, and freedom of religion means that we have to have places of worship. I think this is a problem. So each person in their field has to do what they can. My field is de-radicalization. The different reactions to grievances vary. With one word, I'd say that some people go through politics because an ideology doesn't skewer for them the path forward. Others, when they have grievances, an ideology comes along, hijacks that cause, and then they recalibrate in their minds every other grievance that they see as defined for them by that ideology. And I've gone into a lot of detail in this in that 7-hour seminar. I do apologise for it being 7 hours, but it's, I had a lot to get out after 16 years.
We're entering now something like the last 10 minutes of the debate, so thus this will be the either the ultimate or the penultimate round of questions. So, please.
Yeah, my name is Fred Rosenbaum. I'd like to ask you if there's a problem in the UK with young Muslims being very anti-Semitic, because there is a problem here in Denmark.
All right. Do you have more questions from the floor while we are Opening it up. This is beginning to look like your last chance. I will make a priority of anyone who hasn't asked a question yet. So that's an even grander invitation. All right, the anti-Semitism question. Ed?
Yeah, that is a genuine problem once got to accept that it's part of that Leninist worldview, but it's also backed up by events in Israel that young Muslims link back to the Jewish community, unfortunately. And in recent years, there's been what we call a community safety trust, that's a voluntary set-up organisation where elderly Jewish people going to synagogues in certain parts of London and outside London have to be sadly accompanied by security. I was at the Chief Rabbi's office about 4 weeks ago, and he was quoting stats to me of a 200% increase in anti-Semitic activities on university campuses, but less on communities. So there is that issue to bear in mind. Why universities and where is it coming from? And the final point here would be this, that in the United States last year when there was a huge Muslim convention, the Muslim groups there had a marrying up with synagogues. So you'd have a mosque in downtown New York marrying up with, or twinning up with a synagogue. In Britain, we're far from that. In doing that, the Muslim mindset still sadly isn't ready enough. In Denmark, we don't even officially have mosques. I get that, so not way to go. So you know.
But it is somewhat related to the point that Sherin made, and which was somewhat in opposition to the point that you made earlier, where you basically said, well, if there were no grievances, they would still be there. They would find another pretext. Now, the anti-Semitism question, of course, relates to the international question. If Muslims feel that they should answer your query about why poor Britons, working-class Britons don't react in the same way, well, they aren't Muslims. They aren't part of a movement and of an international community that feels itself victimized in a number of contexts in the Middle East and elsewhere.
No, because the vast majority of suicide bombers to date have come from a certain socio-economic factor backed up by a certain ideology. They have not been poor people from Bangladesh. They have not been poor people from Ethiopia. They have not been poor people from the slums of Indonesia. They have been poor people from the Arab world with certain ideological...
But that sort of proves the point, doesn't it? That they feel like members of an international community because of their religion. That's why they feel victimized.
And Bangladeshis and Indonesians and Uzbeks and others, and Tatars and Spanish Muslims and others are part of that Islamic community.
Yes.
So why aren't they becoming suicide bombers?
Well, but they feel victimized as well, don't they?
But where's that response? The response that extreme response.
Right.
The point I'm trying to make is that ideology. I'm not saying it's the only thing, but ideology is key.
But so you're saying that religion is really not as significant as it may look, that the mere fact that you being a Muslim and belonging to that international community is not a very strong factor in your identity because it doesn't make you think a certain way.
Well, it doesn't. The very fact is that the people like myself and hundreds of others who go to the Arab world, we thought we were joining the Muslim Ummah. When I went out to live in Saudi Arabia, I thought I was living to join the Muslim Ummah. I faced more racism in Saudi Arabia than I faced anywhere else in my world. So don't come telling me that somehow there's a global Muslim Ummah. It's a myth. That's the first point about the Muslim Ummah. And the second point I want to make is this, and this is very important. This lie, this pup that we've been sold, that there's such a thing as an Ummah which we all belong to, based on what the Prophet Muhammad said. It's not true. When the Prophet Muhammad moved from Mecca to Medina, the Ummah that he spoke about included Jews, included Christians. It was a civil society, and it included Muslims. That was the Ummah, the genuine archetype of Ummah. What we've now got is a post-colonial psyche that there's this huge them called the West, and there's this huge us called the Muslim world, and we're a political bloc. Sorry, it just doesn't stand up to scrutiny.
But please.
Yes, only some of the point. It's very, very important. The grievances issue is very important as well. I know what I used to train people in when recruiting them to Hizb-ut-Tahrir. I know that I taught them quite successfully that where there's not a grievance, you discover a grievance and you prove a grievance to exist. Let me give an example of that. Hizb-ut-Tahrir are working to overthrow the Turkish government and its regime and its system, not just the government. Turkey is more democratic than most Muslim countries, and I'm talking relatively for anyone who's down the throat. Relatively more democratic than Egypt, than Syria, than Iran, than Saudi. Hizb-ut-Tahrir are opposed to dictatorships and democracies for another reason. It's a religious motivation, which is actually an ideological motivation justified by religion. And as Sherin correctly said, and I've taught for 16 years, where you don't find any grievance such as poverty or occupation, it's still fard to overthrow that government, i.e. religiously obligatory to overthrow that government, even if everyone is rich, because God said so. And the main grievance that a member of Hizb-ut-Tahrir is motivated by is the grievance that he doesn't want to burn in hell.
So you're saying that the Israeli-Palestinian question could be solved tomorrow, but make absolutely no difference?
They don't. See, look at that as a classic example. Hizb-ut-Tahrir in Palestine don't want to fight the Israelis because they say we have to wait for the state, and they don't want peace either. It's not about grievances for Hizb-ut-Tahrir, it's an ideology. They are ideologically opposed to the peace process, and they are ideologically opposed to taking weapons in your own hands to resist. They're saying you have to establish a caliphate, and that army will conquer, because they've constructed a solution through the ideology. Now, also we have to keep in mind, on this point of global ummah, that just like communists constructed an international community called the proletariat, the international proletariat, which was transnational, Islamists have done the same thing. The Prophet referred to the Ummah in Medina as Ummatan Wahida, which included Jews and Christians and Muslims in a civil society. Islamists say that the political nation is all Muslims to the exclusion of others. That's not the religious understanding of this word Ummah in Islam. The word Ummah in Islam has two meanings. Ummat al-Muslimin are those who have already become Muslims, and Ummat al-Da'wah, those who are after the Prophet, are all of the Prophet's Ummah, which is why in the Quran, they have to give scripture here, because the thing is some Muslims here which may think this is really strange. In the Quran, when the Prophet referred to the Quraysh who were polytheists, they weren't Muslims, he says, Ya qawmi, my people. He says, my people, because they were his people. The ummah of every prophet, the nation of every prophet is all of humanity after him. The nation of Jesus was all of humanity after Jesus. The nation of Muhammad is all of humanity after Muhammad, because that message is universal. Islamists have distorted this concept of ummah for political reasons, just like the communists did.
The final question of the night from the assembly, please.
Short question. What brought you to change your mind?
What brought you to change your mind? Sorry, please.
Yeah. What happened? Who changed it?
Was there a specific point, Maajid, where you changed?
Oh, you talking about a specific point? Yeah.
Like your specific
Right. Okay. Yes. Sorry. Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yeah. Was there a tipping point? Yeah.
You felt you had to press the point of sort of.
Yeah. Was there a tipping point?
Was it like an aha experience? What
Yeah.
brought a young person intensely involved to that degree to
Yes.
move out of that?
Amnesty International comes into this story, and I'm very happy you raised this. When I was arrested, I was, as we know, subjected to witnessing torture and then detained and convicted to 5 years for membership of Hizb-ut-Tahrir. Hizb-ut-Tahrir have a policy where they don't look after any of their members that have been imprisoned or their families, because they say it's a distraction from the true mission, from the true objective, which is you have to continuously work for the Khilafah and its establishment. And therefore, when I was imprisoned, not only was my cause not supported officially by the party, which I understood because I taught that to other people as well, but what really, really wound me up is that some people were sitting in their armchairs in London, actually was the leader of HT at the time, who was sitting on his armchair in London, and some of the Egyptian members of HT had, under brutal torture, capitulated and decided to denounce, not to admit that they were members. That's all they did, they denied that they were members of HT. And this armchair critic, is the polite way of putting it, that was sitting in the UK, basically sent correspondence via our wives who came to visit us while the court case was going on, and had the audacity to say, you guys are not being defiant enough. Okay. If anyone remembers the footage from the case, every single time we descended to court, we were shouting our heads off against the Egyptian regime. His point was that some of the Egyptians had denied being members in their official plea to the charges, therefore they weren't being defiant enough. Right? This guy's never experienced a discomfort in his life. Then what happened is, I was quite upset with them at this time. Who I considered were my enemies, Amnesty International, who what I consider would propagate human rights into the Muslim world as a tool of colonialism, to intellectually colonize the Muslims' minds. And so I viewed them as that. People that I considered my enemies and who I had publicly criticized before as a member of HT, had the courage, the bravery and the mercy and the compassion to adopt me as a prisoner of conscience. And there's one man called John Cornwall, and he would continuously write to me every week. I got about one letter from a member of Hizb-ut-Tahrir, and one visit by a friend who actually had left Hizb-ut-Tahrir, and that's why he was able to come and visit me. This guy, a Christian, a practicing, faithful Christian, who knew my views about human rights, nevertheless adopted me as a prisoner of conscience via the international leadership of Amnesty, and continued to write to me every week. Before someone can change their mind about a construct that they've adopted rigidly for 16 years, there needs to be a change in their heart. Their heart needs to be willing to accept something different. My heart was opened up by the compassion shown to me by this person that I have defined as my enemy. Once my heart was opened up, I was ready to study, and that was the key point. Then I began studying with religious authorities, graduates of Azhar, and the books of Al-Jama'ah al-Islamiyya that I've mentioned, and I was able to take away the indoctrination that I've been propagating for so long. And Amnesty International, I have to applaud them for their continuous efforts. I really have a lot of respect for their work.
Sherin?
I want to emphasize. I want to emphasize that what we're doing today is the starting point, and this is not a war or a battle against Hizb-ut-Tahrir. This is an intellectual challenge. But when I hear Maajid speak right now, I realize that this is not enough, because the question is, how do we touch the hearts? Because there has to be a change of heart. So it's not enough with intellectual arguments. It's not enough with the intellectual challenge. How do we touch the hearts of the members or potential coming sympathizers or supporters of Hizb-ut-Tahrir? What do we do in that sense? This is a question we have to work on.
Ed, final comment?
Yeah, I mean, very briefly in response to the question, that one has to be, sadly pessimistic, in that there are a group of people who are beyond the pale, even within Hizb-ut-Tahrir, who will not get back, who are dead set. But the optimism is this: the vast majority are not. The vast majority are open to change, and the fact that we can sit here and say this is the proof in the pudding that we too came out. And others have. In Britain we've got several, but I won't go into detail, but many people have. The intellectual challenge point that Sherin raises is very important, because the intellectual challenge point and the intellectual critique of Hizb-ut-Tahrir will not touch very many Hizb-ut-Tahrir people because their hearts aren't innocent, but it will touch the vast majority of Muslims, young Muslims, who may be considering joining these groups, because they will see, well, actually there's a counter-argument. There are people who've been there, done that, got the t-shirt part saying it's not worth going down that road. Does that help?
Do you make t-shirts like that?
It's a practical.
I was a member of Hizb-ut-Tahrir and all I got was this.
It was a good one.
All right, ladies and gentlemen. Now, the reason we've been going at such speed for the last half an hour, of course, is in order to include as many of your questions as we
I
could.
have to comment on what, can you hear me? Yeah. On what my brother said, because I disagree with him. I think that it's arrogant to claim that some people are, beyond where we can reach them, because it's up to God to plant something within a person that can make him change, and everyone can change within a very short period. It's something beyond our imagination. We can't imagine that. So also we have to be patient with the fact that people are traveling in a differently on the path, whatever you call it, on the.
I'll tell you what you could do, though. Is that one of the reasons what made me sort of reconsider the whole thing of Hizb-ut-Tahrir was falling in love with a beautiful woman. So more of that, perhaps.
So if that is generally applicable, that's really what you're saying. All right, thank you very much.